Okay, so elections and electoral systems. Or I subtitle this Everything I Research Condensed into One Lecture, which is going to be fun. So we'll see how quickly we can get through all of this. So I guess the first question, why do we hold elections? The thing that you have to remember is that elections are the way that most ordinary citizens participate in politics. We know that in a pure democracy, every individual would vote on every issue, but we know that that's really unrealistic, especially today with the complexity of issues that are involved and the fact that there's so many people, you can't just kind of get them all out to sit on a field and vote on everything all day as you could in Athenian democracy. So instead what we do is we have elections, and that's the way in which ordinary citizens participate in politics. Yes, there's other ways of political participation, signing petitions, going to protests, boycotting or boycotting. But essentially, the way that most citizens participate in politics is through periodic elections. So what's the point? They serve a number of purposes. First, to select representatives, so decide who's going to focus on governing while we go and do all of our other tasks and all of our other trades. You need to have some people who are focusing on that, who are going to be looking through legislation with a fine-tooth comb, and that just can't be everybody because we still need to farm and eat and teach university courses and be in the military and such. And then so the second thing is that they give the government legitimacy. So it's a way to make people confident in their government and make them willing to follow their laws. If you didn't have much of a say in the government, it'd probably be a lot more difficult for you to be willing to follow the laws made by that government. So elections provide us a means to do this. So today we're going to talk about two things, electoral systems, and the second is electoral integrity. And I'll get into what both of those mean when we get into the specific section. So we'll start off with electoral systems. And so in its most basic way, an electoral system is essentially how we translate a whole bunch of votes into power in some sort of legislative body. That's kind of the easy way of describing an electoral system. Now, as you'll read in the suggested reading for this week, Norris's Electoral Engineering, there's a lot more components of how we design elections and electoral systems than just how we translate votes into seats via which type of formula or which type of system we use. There's a lot of other considerations, but we're going to focus today on this idea of, okay, everybody goes to the polls, they vote. How does that translate into power in government? So there are two major families of electoral systems. There's the majoritarian and the proportional system. So a majoritarian or a plurality system is pretty much just whoever gets the most votes wins the seat, wins it all. The proportional system, though, is where you divide up power based on the proportion of votes you get, and usually via a party. So there's a variety of different types of each of these major families of electoral systems. We use first past the post, single member plurality here in Canada. There's also runoff systems where you can have either 2 rounds of elections like they do in France, or an alternative vote, so an instant runoff ranked ballot, which we're actually going to get in Kingston in the next municipal election, also used in Australia. So those are kind of the two major ways that we would have a majoritarian system. So first past the post, whoever gets the most wins, or you do an initial election, and then the top 2 candidates battle it out in a second round, or you do that instant runoff. The second way is proportional. So essentially you get the proportion of votes that you get for your seats. That's in a kind of a strict PR system. You can have an open list, meaning that you get also some choice as to who those people are that are filling the seats, or you can have a closed list where the party decides and you don't get much of a say. You can have a mixed member system, so where you're combining majoritarian and proportional. So I guess technically this could be like a mix of both of these. And then single transferable vote where there are multi-member districts. So I'm going to send you to a playlist from one of my favorite YouTubers, CGP Grey. So he has a bunch of videos, The Politics of the Animal Kingdom, where he goes through scenarios to explain each of these electoral systems. So if electoral systems is something, yes, I've studied this in all of my previous courses, I understand what proportional representation means. No need to go to the playlist. If you are a little confused about anything I just said, head on over to the playlist and it will explain the major systems to you. There's also a video on gerrymandering, which is just for fun, so skip that one if you want. Just To mention, though, he's CGP Grey in his videos is very much not in favor of first past the post. So take that with a grain of salt. There are definitely advantages of first past the post. And we're going to talk more about those in class anyway. So just be aware that there is some bias involved. But I think he does a really good job of explaining it with kind of a real, well, not a real scenario because it's animals, but still, you get the gist. So that's electoral systems. So the question you often get asked is, okay, well then what's the best electoral system? And like every good political science question, it depends. The way I like to describe it is it really just depends on what you want to get out of government, what you want to get out of voting, what you want to get out of representation. So instead of saying, is each electoral system, is there a specific best one? I would say, it depends on what your values are for the system. So here's some of the questions that you're going to have to ask. The first is, what do you want government to look like? So we know that some electoral systems tend to produce majority governments or minority governments. So first past the post systems tend to produce majority governments, proportional representation. There tends to be more political parties because everybody kind of has a shot of getting some power at least. And you might be more likely to have a minority government or a coalition government. So there's benefits and fallbacks to majority governments or minority governments. You probably hopefully learned that in POE 205. And so the question is, what kind of government do you want? Do you want one that's pretty stable, pretty able to quickly get legislation through, or do you want one that involves a lot more viewpoints, but maybe might be more likely to fall apart pretty quickly or take forever to get anything done? What do you want actually the people sitting in government to look like? Do you want more women and minorities? Generally, we say that proportional representation is going to help do that because the parties decide who is going to be on their list. And so they can say, every second person on our list is going to be a woman, or we're going to include a lot of minorities on our list, especially if these minorities are geographically diffused, so they're not specifically in one particular geographic region. This can actually help them have more representation. The next question might be, what do you want your voting experience to be like? Do you want just like a simple ballot like we have in Canada where there's a list of 5 names or whatever, and you just check off one and that's it? Or do you want more choice in the matter? Maybe you want to choose both a party and an individual member. So in that case, you might want a mixed member proportional system. Do you want more parties to choose from? A PR system, a proportional representation system, is probably going to give you more parties to choose from because it's a lot easier, as I mentioned, to kind of break through. If you get 10% of the vote, you're going to get 10% of the seats. Whereas in a first past the post system, if you get 10% of the vote in a single riding, you're probably not going to win a seat there. So do you want more different types of political parties? That can be a good thing in the sense that you have more views represented. It can be a bad thing in the sense that you might end up having an extreme right-wing party getting some power and holding the balance of power, just as an example. The other question you want to ask is, what do I value most in representation? Do I want to be represented by my geography? This can be really important, especially for rural voters. So I come from Northern Ontario, and our ridings are already pretty huge. And so when there was talk of mixed member proportional in Ontario, a lot of Northern Ontarians were saying, hey, wait a second, we don't want our ridings to get much bigger. But for other sorts of population groups, say for women or for a specific ethnic minority that might not be concentrated in a geographic area, this might be a better way to have representation of their interests. Do you want representation by population? Is it really important to you that every single vote in the end has, I don't want to say matters, but that's one way the PR proponents tend to explain it that way. But do you want it to reflect the popular vote, we'll say? So we know that our system, you can have a very different level of popular vote than you do percentage of seats in the House. Electoral College does that too. It's an electoral system that transfers votes into power, in this case, the power of the President of the United States. And we know that popular vote does not necessarily mean you're going to win the presidency in terms of the Electoral College. So what's important to you? And then again, representation of smaller group interests. Do you want your coalitions to get made before the election or after the election? That's kind of one of the ways that we describe that. Do you want people to build larger parties, the more bigger tent parties, as I like to say, or do you prefer to have smaller group interests all represented specifically? So short answer to the question, which electoral system is the best? It depends on what you value in government, in voting, and representation. There is no perfect answer. Sorry, can't answer that question. All right, so the second thing that we wanted to look at today is electoral integrity. So we have our election set up, we figured out what our rules are going to be. How do we judge the quality of an election? And so this is the main thrust of what my research is about, is electoral integrity and how we look at the quality of an election. And electoral system is part of that. But there's also many other components of elections than just how we're going to translate votes into seats. So why do we want to go about assessing the quality of elections? Well, for practitioners, it's pretty clear. It's important to assess where improvements can be made. For scholars, it helps us, for example, to define regime types. So the quality of an election is going to help us know, are we talking about a democracy or not? And so there's a variety of different approaches we can take to understanding the quality of an election. So the first is a legal approach. So essentially, is an election conducted according to the laws set out before the election? So essentially, we set up this electoral system. We set up who can vote, who can't vote. We set up who can be registered, who can't. Are those laws being respected? So some questions you might ask, are citizens who are deemed ineligible to vote still casting ballots? Are political parties operating within campaign spending limits? Does the vote count procedures align with those set out by the country's election laws, for example? So that's the general legal approach. But you might be able to see some problems with that. First of all, election laws are very different in every country. So does that mean the standards by which we judge elections are different in every country? If so, that's going to be really tough for judging elections. And the second question, of course, is, well, what about unfair laws? So let's say you're in a country where only one state-sanctioned party can compete. It's going to adhere to its election laws, but it's not necessarily going to allow for citizens' viewpoints to be represented. So sometimes the legal approach is important, but in general, in comparative research, we probably don't use that quite as much as the other two approaches that I'm going to talk about. The next approach is this sociological approach. So essentially, you're judging the quality of elections based on their cultural context. So what citizens expect of an election in Canada are probably going to be quite different than what citizens expect of an election in Afghanistan. In Canada, if there's any little piece of violence at the polls, we would say, no, that's just not acceptable. Whereas in a country like Afghanistan, violence, unfortunately, is just part of life in a lot of regions. And so, a successful election free from violence doesn't mean absolutely no violence being perpetrated. But again, there's going to be some problems with this. Just like I said, what if laws or practices are unfair to start with? How exactly do we judge that? We often use measures of what people think about elections, but the standards that even people think of using elections are very quite different. So like I said, the example of Canada and Afghanistan of violence in election and at an election polling station. A similar example, for example, a ballot box goes missing in Australia, and that has a very different meaning than a ballot box going missing in Russia, for example. So in Australia, there was the famous example of a bunch of ballot boxes fell off the end of a truck. And this was seen as complete technical incompetence, an issue for their electoral commission. People were disappointed, of course, but it was an issue of technical incompetence. Ballot box goes missing in Russia. We're likely probably not going to, our first thought won't be technical incompetence. It's going to be deliberate manipulation. So the same event can mean very different things in different places. And what about minority groups who might not be in the majority in thinking that an election is unfair considering the context? There's going to be cases where the majority of the population thinks, hey, this went really well. We got what we wanted, but there might be a minority whose rights were being violated. And that might not show up in a public opinion survey, for example. And so therefore, the third approach, and the approach that I tend to use when I do research on electoral integrity, is this normative approach, where we judge the quality of elections based on international norms and standards that have been agreed upon by the international community. So a norm is essentially just an appropriate standard of behavior or actions given the circumstances. And this allows us to compare between countries because every country is subject to the same set of standards for elections. So what are those standards? So what we would look is we take a look at what international agreements exist regarding the standards for elections. So this is from the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. I'll just read it out for you. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. All right, so let's take a look at this. What kind of things are we looking at? So periodic elections, that means that they're going to be happening regularly over every 3 years, every 4 years, every 5 years, in a kind of predictable fashion. We know after a certain amount of time we're going to have another election. You can't just have one election say, okay, for the next 100 years, there we go, we're done. Nope, that doesn't make it very democratic. Genuine elections, that's another good word, that it actually means something, that the person who gets in actually gets into power. It's not just kind of a sham election where afterwards nothing happens. Universal suffrage means everybody can vote. Equal suffrage, again, same thing, that everyone's vote counts the same. And secret vote, meaning that nobody should know who you're voting for. So you really have that freedom to express your opinions without being afraid of of being persecuted for that, whether that be by the people around you, by the Electoral Commission, by the government, etc., etc. Here's the OSCE, so the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Copenhagen document, which lays out a lot more information about the quality of elections. And they say free elections that will be held at reasonable intervals by secret ballot or by equivalent free voting procedure, under conditions which ensure in practice the free expression of the opinion of the electors in their choice of representatives. So this idea that there needs to be conditions which ensure the practice of free expression. So people actually have to have genuine choice and able to actually express that genuine choice in their elections. So these things are a little vague. There are other documents that provide a lot more detail about going into what that actually means. We know that scholars want to interpret the international norms and standards and find some sort of way to codify what do we mean by people having genuine choice. And scholars, as we mentioned we talked a little bit about elections do not necessarily lead to democracy. We know that just having an election isn't good enough. There are dictatorships that hold elections. There are dictatorships who have full turnout and hold elections, and the dictators win. So what kind of conditions do we want? So a lot of the early literature talked about having free and fair elections. So free meaning referring to the rules of the game. So what sorts of laws are in practice, what kind of electoral system are going to be used, who's allowed to vote. But they recognize that, just like I was saying, the legal approach, that even though law says everyone can vote, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to happen. There might still be intimidations at a polling station or some other ways that you're preventing people from going to vote. So we say in addition to free elections, we need to have fair elections. So the application of the law being respected. And then also the spirit of the law being put into place. So in reality, does everyone actually have access to polls? Are polls within a reasonable distance? Are there ways that those with disabilities are able to get to polls? Are people free from intimidation? The problem, of course, is that you can quickly see the problem with this approach, that at what point is an election really free and fair? We all have challenges to elections. People might not be able to vote because they don't have the right identification. Does that make the entire election therefore not free and fair? So let's say people don't have their driver's license or something because perhaps they don't have a permanent address or whatnot, and there's no prescription for how they're going to vote. Well, does that mean the entire contest is not free and fair? We need to have kind of a better way of approaching this. So that's what I was just saying. So that's why we talk about this greater issue of electoral integrity. And so one of my mentors, Pippa Norris, wrote the book essentially, the trilogy of books on this particular issue. And scholars like her have adopted a different approach. We tend not to use free and fair anymore as kind of a moniker of good elections. It's about applying these international norms and standards that we talked about earlier to all elections in every country. And all elections are going to have some challenges to electoral integrity. Some elections struggle with voter intimidation. Some of them struggle with identification laws. Some struggle to register all voters. So what you do is you approach the elections through an electoral cycle. The idea that elections, I'll explain this in a second, but the idea that elections happen not just on election day, but before and after as well, and go about trying to measure the quality of elections. There are, of course, problems with this approach too. First of all, how do we do that measurement? Do we ask citizens? Do we ask experts to judge? Is it too formulaic? Are we kind of forgetting about some of the context where certain actions or certain violations of electoral integrity can mean very different things in different countries? Is it too Western-centric? So, of course, there are also drawbacks to this approach as well. But generally, when I do my research, I'm looking at a whole electoral cycle approach. I'm using this electoral integrity framework. And so I talked just a minute ago about the electoral cycle approach, this idea that elections are not just what happens on election day. So first of all, there's this pre-electoral period. And so that's where laws are being decided, where electoral systems are being designed. Authorities might be training poll workers. They might be getting ahead on registering voters. So this is always happening. Right now, we have an election coming up. We're not in the campaign phase yet in Canada, but we're in this pre-electoral period. We've been in it since the end of the last campaign, in the sense that Elections Canada is working on registering voters, identifying people who are going to be returning officers. Also, the government has been working on making some changes to Canada's electoral law since 2015. So that's what we call the pre-electoral period. So you definitely have to focus on that too. Then there's going to be the campaign period. And that's when parties and candidates choose to run for elections. There's going to be certain issues with campaign finance, how much money is getting used, what kind of media is being used to attract voters. And there's also going to be renewed efforts at voter registration by certain closing dates, for example. And that's when really the electoral apparatus really kicks in. Then, of course, you get election day. As it sounds, it's when voters are going to the polls, and then you get the aftermath. So when you're counting up the ballots, in Canada, it happens pretty quickly because everything happens so decentralized. But in some countries, it takes a lot longer to count the ballots, especially if you have a complicated formula or if you're not using technology to assist. And then there's, the aftermath of, do all the candidates actually support the results of this election? Because there's lots of cases where the opposition party will say, no, it was all a sham. And then it's, if the actual people who won the election are not getting into power, then that's also an electoral issue. And then we call it a cycle because then it just starts all over again, right? So our electoral cycle for this go-round started at the end of the last election. So you're constantly within a cycle of elections. It's not just what happens on election day, and that's the approach that many scholars now use to understand how we judge the quality of an election. I think it's time for a case study. All right, so let's take a look at the election that just happened last week, or at least when I'm recording this last week, in Nigeria. So I'm going to send you over to this YouTube video and just watch from this section because there's actually also some information about a Senegalese election. So you're welcome to go watch it as well. And then come back and we'll have a quick chat about that. So hopefully you're back. Welcome back. So the two questions I wanted to talk about is, what were the major challenges to electoral integrity, at least according to this news report, and what stage of the electoral cycle did this challenge emerge? So of course, there's probably a lot more challenges, but we're kind of just seeing the election day and the pre-electoral cycle in this report because it was done shortly after the election. And so we're really just getting this campaign period issues and very much election day issues. Some of the issues they bring up were questions about the Electoral Commission. So an Electoral Commission is essentially just like Elections Canada. So whatever body, whatever government agency or department is actually running elections. We also call these electoral management bodies. So there were some issues about, was this body actually being impartial? The idea is that they're supposed to be running elections free from political interference. And so one of the questions that was brought up in this news report is, was the Electoral Commission actually colluding with the current government? Were electoral officials being harassed? Were they being told to change the results? There's also some issues with the Electoral Commission in terms of people noticing technical errors or irregularities. So it's another actor that we can consider a lot, is the Electoral Commission. What are they doing and how do they relate in terms of independence, in terms of impartiality, but then also in terms of capacity to actually achieve their their function, which is to run a credible election. In terms of there was a delay, so in this case, the election was delayed for a week because there was issues of technical issues that needed to get sorted out. And so this can lead to issues of illegitimacy of the election. So people saying, hey, wait a second, you can't just keep shifting the election date. And the news reporter explains that there was lower turnout because of that, because people just kind of stopped caring, especially when they think, okay, does it really matter what I vote for if there's going to be so many irregularities and the results are kind of rigged from the get-go? Does it really matter who I end up voting for? And that can actually lower turnout. There's also electoral violence issues. Firstly, yes, because supporters of different candidates were clashing, and then also different groups using the election as a way to air their grievances. Elections are pretty high-profile events. International media take attention to them, and so elections can sometimes serve as a focal point for flare-ups of existing tensions that exist in our country or within a region. So that's one example of electoral integrity and election in practice. So head on over to the quiz, and there'll be material on there from the Electoral Systems. So make sure you watch the CGP Gray videos if you are not familiar with electoral systems. There will be questions about that. And then also on this electoral integrity issue.